You know, for those of us who were born and raised in the Western world, especially, what does that mean? That means North America, that means much of Latin America, much of South and Central America. That means certainly all of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So many places that we culturally consider to be the West. For those individuals who were born and raised in the Western world, of course, we know that the Christmas holiday season is something that is of great importance, both spiritually, but also even culturally. Indeed, it's interesting. A person can even be a semi-atheist or not really interested in spirituality whatsoever, but nonetheless, they'll still celebrate Christmas as a very important holiday. And given the fact that indeed Christmas is coming up, I thought I would take this opportunity to give a talk very specifically on the Vedic understanding of who is Jesus, what are his teachings, what is his significance vis-a-vis Sanatana Dharma, the Vedic tradition. And this is something that many people have written about, actually. This is not a controversial topic. Indeed, some of the most famous gurus throughout history have spoken about this, have written about this. Prabhupada, for example, wrote and spoke extensively about Jesus. Paramahamsa Yogananda, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and trust me, I can go on and mention hundreds, actually, of Hindu gurus. I'll use that term because some of them are more legitimate than others, but within the greater sphere of what we culturally call Hinduism, again, many individuals, swamis, gurus, etc., have spoken about Jesus, and 99.9% of them extremely favorably so. So I'm not the only individual who has given this sort of a talk explaining what precisely is the Vedic understanding of Jesus. However, this talk will most likely be the most comprehensive in understanding this person. First of all, before I begin, again, let me just say that I personally am not a Christian in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. And interestingly, even though, again, I was born and raised in the Western world, and individuals who are not very conversant with the West might think that by default, I must have been born and raised a Christian. I have never been a Christian in my entire life, actually. My parents were nominal Christians. They weren't very religious in any way. I believe that when I was extremely young, maybe they took me to church maybe once a year for Easter or something like that, and that only lasted for a few years. I was never baptized. I was never confirmed. Again, I personally was never a Christian in any way whatsoever, and I certainly am not a Christian now. I am a follower of Sanatana Dharma, of the Vedic way. I am a practicing Vaishnava. My theology and philosophy and practices are all what are called the Vaishnava Dharma. I consider God to be Sriman Narayana and all of the aspects of Sriman Narayana, that is all of the avatars or all of the plenary portions, etc. And my personal approach, as well as that of the ISDS, is radically orthodox Vedic, and with nothing else added to that. Again, people who have followed my teachings for a very long time are extremely aware of that I don't mix and match. I don't add other religious content to Sanatana Dharma. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because, unfortunately, there are foolish people out there who, because I'm talking about Jesus, might suddenly now say, oh, I guess Acharya is a Christian after all. Well, if that's the case, then again, all the gurus I mentioned also must be, including Prabhupada. There have been literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gurus just in the past 70, 80 years who also have said essentially what I am about to say in this lecture, and that does not make them Christian, and neither does it make me a Christian. I am a follower of Sanatana Dharma exclusively. Now, all that being said, what we're going to be presenting is indeed the Vedic teachings of the Vedic teaching on who precisely is Jesus, what is the validity, if any, of his teachings, etc., etc. And this is what we'll be talking about very specifically. And before we dive very deeply into that, the first distinction that I need to make is that of Abrahamism versus Dharma. This is something I've written about very extensively. This is something that I've spoken about very extensively. Indeed, we have at least one video, maybe more, where I am interviewed and I go very deeply into what are the differences between the Dharmic worldview, and by that we don't mean simply Hindu. We mean basically everything that is pre-Abrahamic versus that which is Abrahamic. So I'm not going to go very, very deeply into that because, again, in other places, I go probably deeper than anyone ever has in writing and, again, in other ways into what are the distinctions. But let me just say that certainly Abrahamism and Dharma are diametrically opposed, spiritually, philosophically, as far as worldview, as far as aim, even as far as their goals. They are diametrically opposed to each other in every way. There is, sadly, zero reconciliation between the two. There is no reconciliation between Dharma, that is natural law, versus Abrahamism, which is actually anti-natural law. So that's the first distinction that needs to be made. Now, that being said, what are meant by the Abrahamic religions? Well, again, without going too deeply, essentially we're talking about Judaism, mainstream Christianity, that is the vast majority of Christianity, and Islam. Theologically, those are the three largest Abrahamic religions. But then, of course, there are offshoots of this. I have made the argument, and I think very successfully so, that interestingly, Marxism is a philosophical offshoot of Abrahamism. And again, without going too deeply into that, just read my book, The Dharma Manifesto, where I go very deeply into this, and I show how Marxism, even though it purports to be atheistic, is actually satanic. It's actually Luciferian. But more, it is quite literally an offshoot of Abrahamism. And then there are smaller offshoots, the Baha'i religion, for example, things like that. Now, with this understanding, it is important to understand that when we speak about Jesus as a person, there are really two separate traditions as far as interpreting who Jesus is. There is indeed the Abrahamic tradition, that is the tradition that's based upon Old Testament, but then there is the Dharmic tradition and the Dharmic understanding of who is Jesus and what are his teachings. What we've seen with Christianity, as opposed to, let's say, Judaism or Islam, which are purely 100% Abrahamic. What we've seen with Christianity, on the other hand, is that Christianity has never been 100% Abrahamic. Indeed, throughout the 2,000-year-old history of Christianity, we have seen a tension that was there within Christian culture and theology between, on the one hand, yes, indeed, very large degree of Abrahamic influence. And we see this especially theologically as far as church doctrine, church organization, etc., etc. But then we have also seen that there has been a very pronounced, if more quiet, stream that is actually dharmic. And we see this not so much even in the religion itself, but again, in the person of Jesus. In the person of Jesus. What we see is that there has been this tension between Constantinian Christianity, that is the Christianity of Constantine, which is indeed quite Abrahamic and which has led to the form of mainstream Christianity that we see today, versus what some people call the more mystical elements of Christianity. In some cases, Gnosticism, in other cases, just various Christian saints who truly did try their best to follow in the actual footsteps of Jesus, etc. So again, there's always been that tension that's been there. As far as Jesus himself, it is very, very important to understand that Jesus himself was indeed not an Abrahamist. For that matter, and I always have to point this out to people, Jesus was not Christian. Jesus did not come here to either fulfill the, let's say, older religion of the Old Testament, but neither did he come here to establish a new religion either. The idea of quote-unquote Christianity is something that came about after Jesus left this world. Again, Jesus did not come here to start a new religion, but then for that matter, he did not come here to quote-unquote reform Judaism either. Rather, what Jesus did was indeed, in his own way, given his audience, the fact that his audience really were not individuals who were very conversant with Dharma in any way whatsoever, really. What he attempted to do was to teach Dharma within the context of the culture of the Levant, what we would call Palestine, and this Old Testament culture. He attempted to teach Dharma in every way. But what we have seen is that, of course, Jesus himself was indeed not an Abrahamist. Jesus himself was not really a follower of the Old Testament. How do we know this? Well, in many ways. All you have to do is indeed read the teachings of Jesus, read the stories of what happened to him, and you see that all throughout his ministry, all throughout the time that he was preaching, he was always at odds with the religious leaders of his time. That is, the religious leaders of Judaism at the time. That is, the religious leaders who were following the Old Testament. They recognized in Jesus, and again, all you need to do to see the evidence of this is read the Gospels. They recognized in Jesus someone who was opposed to their religious doctrines. And he showed this again and again and again in his teachings, in not following the Sabbath, in indeed doing work on the Sabbath and being chastised by the Pharisees, etc., etc. What we also see is that Jesus was even worshiping a different being from the Abrahamists of his time. These Abrahamists were indeed worshiping Yahweh. They were worshiping this localized desert metaphysical being who we find throughout the totality of the Old Testament, who has its own characteristics. But this was not what Jesus taught as far as the nature of God, and this was not the being who he worshipped. Rather, the God who Jesus worshipped was a radically different being from what was followed in the Old Testament and what was portrayed in the Old Testament. The God of Jesus represented a complete break theologically from Old Testament Judaism. And this was a being, this was a God who, rather than being harsh, rather than being angry, rather than being jealous, rather than asking that we fear him, this was a God who Jesus worshipped, who was the very opposite, who was a God of love, who was a God who asked us merely to surrender to him. So again, and I can go on and on. Again, I don't need to. Take a look at the New Testament and you'll see how the religious leaders, the Abrahamic religious leaders of his day, could not understand what Jesus was doing, and they saw him as a radical threat to the point of killing him. Now, what does this say? For those individuals who believe that Jesus was just a continuation of indeed Abrahamism and the Old Testament, that he wasn't really doing anything new, what does this say that, again, throughout the totality of the stories of Jesus, all the religious leaders were not only opposed to his teachings and what he was doing, but to the point of literally killing him? Interestingly, he was recognized as a religious leader in his own right. He was recognized as an individual who was close to God in his own right. To take the life of such a person is not something that would have been done very lightly, just because you have some little theological disagreement or something like that. Regardless of the religion involved, there's always some little theological disagreement, and you simply debate it, etc. You kind of theologically denounce each other. But to take that ultimate step of finding someone to be such a threat to your worldview that you will quite literally kill the person, and in the most horrific of ways imaginable, this is what shows us that indeed Jesus was not an Abrahamist. He was a follower of Dharma. So, all that being said, several things that I want to talk about. And one of these is how Jesus taught indeed something very different from the Abrahamists of his time. His concept of God was something very different. Also, his concept of ethics was also something that was very, very different. You know, we know for a fact that when it comes to the Judaism of Jesus' time, these individuals, indeed, ethically, morally, followed the Old Testament, and very specifically, they followed the laws of Deuteronomy. They followed all of these over 600 laws that they considered to be sacrosanct. These include the kosher laws and various laws of human behavior, morality, etc., etc. Interestingly, these were not laws that Jesus himself stressed in any way whatsoever. Indeed, there are, again, instances where he flaunts these laws, where, for example, according to Abrahamic Judaism, one is not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Well, Jesus did things on the Sabbath, and he was criticized for it. So Jesus himself, interestingly, did not take the laws of Deuteronomy and of the Old Testament very seriously. Rather, he taught something very, very different. His standard of ethics is what later came to be called the Golden Rule, something that was very different from Old Testament understanding, and which again was based upon a different theological understanding of God, not merely as lawgiver, but God as that being who is the source and the origin of love, of all love. Not merely God as a being who judges us, but God as a being who loves us. So that being said, let me read something here actually from one of the Gospels, and this is from Matthew. And throughout this talk, in order to give evidence of what I'm saying, I will indeed be quoting from exclusively the New Testament. The New Testament is a very beautiful document in the Bible. There are 4 Gospels very specifically. So I'll be quoting from the 4 Gospels that talk about the teachings of Jesus. And here is one of them where he indeed describes this golden rule, what is his ethical system juxtaposed to that of the Old Testament and of Abrahamism. So this is Matthew 22, verses 37 to 39. Jesus replied, quote, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." So this is the golden rule. Again, this was the ethical foundation of what Jesus felt was the nature of true morality, of true ethics, of true virtue. As we can see, this is something that is radically different from what we find in the Old Testament and among the Abrahamists of his day, to the point where, again, they felt that he was heretical for saying these things. Now, interestingly, even though Jesus himself was indeed a very great being, in fact, let me talk about that for a moment. The Vedic conception of Jesus, and there is a Vedic conception of Jesus. Again, many gurus taught this, some gurus better than others, but there have been many gurus in the last 100 years or so who have taught this, including Prabhupada. This is something that is supported by Vedic spirituality. Jesus himself was a yogi. Jesus himself was a guru. Jesus himself was an Avesha avatar. He was someone who was empowered by the very grace of God. And we see this, again, in his teachings. We see this in all of his actions, in the stories about him, etc. Indeed, if you were to take the 4 Gospels themselves and separate them from the rest of the Bible, that is certainly the Old Testament, and even the rest of the New Testament, actually, if you were to just look at the personality, the teachings, and the stories about Jesus, what you would be looking at would be non-different than a Vedic sage. Indeed, if you look at the Gospels, and then if you contrast these to the stories, the teachings of thousands of various Vedic sages, you'll find that there's not much difference in any way whatsoever. There might be a few cultural differences, maybe some differences in language. And that being the case, again, because Jesus was an individual who was teaching Dharma in a geographic location where Dharma was not understood. Indeed, according to the Vedic scriptures, he was teaching among the mlechas, that is, individuals who did not understand Dharma. So one could understand why it is the case that, indeed, Jesus stood out like a sore thumb where he was culturally. People had a very difficult time understanding exactly what he was trying to say, who he was, etc., etc. So all that being said, it's an interesting thing that very often, as an individual myself, who I have studied religion for all of my life practically, I began studying religion really before the age of 10. It was at 10 that I began reading various scriptures of the world, including eventually Bhagavad Gita. I went on to go to India and live in ashrams in various places throughout the world, in America, UK, India, etc. I'm someone who ended up getting a PhD in religious studies, etc., etc. For someone like myself, having looked at various patterns in religions, one thing that I have seen is that this is one pattern that we see repeated again and again and again when it comes to the idea of a truly great sage appearing in the world. Someone who, due to the fact that they are so radically empowered by God and surrendered unto God, they have a charisma, they have a power to them that attracts people and that truly has an impact on world history. Whenever you have such an individual appear, inevitably what happens is that person, of course, will attract disciples. That person will attract followers. Some of those individuals will understand the sage and the sage's teachings better than others. Some will understand that sage better than others. But inevitably, regardless of how powerful a sage is, eventually they have to leave. Eventually they, quote unquote, pass away. They leave this world. You know, being a sage does not make you someone who will remain in your body for eternity. No, a sage has a physical body like anyone else, and that body eventually wears down and that person dies. What we have seen, unfortunately, is that whenever there is indeed such a sage and that person does pass away, unfortunately, the quality of that person's teachings then kind of take a step down with the next generation. Regardless of how sincere many of the disciples of that person can be, unfortunately, it's kind of inevitable that when that person passes away, what ends up happening is a process of rigidification, a process of sectarianism, a process in which rather than trying to understand the person's teachings in a living, breathing sort of way, those teachings become rigidified in the form of a dogma, in the form of a theology. And the reason why this is the case is because very often the disciples of that person just don't know what to do. They feel that they have no choice. You can imagine, I know, that when one's guru passes away, it is devastating. It's devastating, especially if this was truly a powerful spiritual being and you were close to that person and you were taking instructions from that person and suddenly that person is not there. It's devastating to the disciples. So this is one of the reactions that people will often have. And it doesn't happen 100% of the time, but it usually does. And that is the fundamentals, the basics of what that great sage was and taught are now again made into a form of statue. They are solidified. They are made into kind of a monument that is just there. And as a result, unfortunately, it becomes very difficult to then replicate the actual experience of having been in the presence of that person. When you're in the presence of the sage, you can feel God through the presence of that sage. When that sage is no longer there, the disciples yearn to experience that feeling again. And all that they can do to try to experience that feeling is to, again, try to immortalize the sage dogmatically. So thus, this is why I have told people many, many times that this is why in Christianity, what ended up happening with the followers of Jesus over multiple generations was that rather than attempting to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, they found that it was easier to just worship him from afar. So this is how Jesus went from a teacher to being a demigod. And the idea that, all that is necessary is to just have faith in this person and pray to this person and have a cross with a depiction of the person up on the wall, etc., etc. It becomes easier to worship such a person rather than follow such a person, rather than try to follow in their footsteps and do as they did, etc. And this is what has led to Christianity as we now have it today. Now, all that being said, I do indeed want to talk a little bit about theology, very specifically. And who precisely was Jesus? Because again, he is indeed recognized from a Vedic perspective. For those who have read the description already of this talk, you'll know that he is actually quite literally mentioned in the Vedic scriptures. But we'll get to that in a little while. There is a Vedic perspective on Jesus. Now, first, let's talk about what is the, let's say, mainstream Nicene Creed following, let's say, perspective on what is called Christology. That is, what is the nature of Christ? And that is, of course, that we know in mainstream Christianity, the idea is that Jesus is quite literally God himself, that he is fully God, fully man, but that he is quite literally God, that he is the incarnation of the Father, of God himself upon the earth. And it is for this reason, unfortunately, that again, rather than trying to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, Jesus being a guru, Jesus being a guide, being a master, and then thus his followers attempting to follow what Jesus actually said and did, rather, Christianity has become a cult of worship, where the idea is, oh, all you need to do is have faith in Jesus. All you need to do is accept Jesus. And that is the extent of the sadhana, one could say. That is the extent of the action that one must perform spiritually in order to have salvation. Well, of course, the Vedic perspective is something radically different from this. And it is something that is supported both in, again, the Vedic scriptures, but interestingly, even in the New Testament as well. And that is that Jesus, indeed, was not God. Jesus was a human being, like any other human being. He was like you, like me, like any other human being, pretty much who you can encounter. However, he was indeed special. He was indeed different. He did indeed come here with a mission, and more, it was that mission coupled with his absolute surrender to God and having become a perfected yogi, a perfected being, having achieved complete enlightenment, but again, coupled with that mission to save the world, that made him into an Avesha avatar, what is called an Avesha avatar. And again, this is the Vedic understanding of Jesus. Now, what is an Avesha avatar? An Avesha avatar is an individual who is human, but who is empowered directly by God, in such a way that when you look upon that person has so diminished his own false ego and his own illusion, and then also, he has so surrendered to God with the mission of serving God in this world that God has fully empowered that individual with his own presence. So thus, this is what an Avesha avatar is. It's a human being who is manifesting the presence of God in such a way that when you look upon that human, yes, in a way, you might as well say that you are also looking upon God. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, this concept of the Avesha avatar, which is a very, very fundamental, very basic, orthodox concept that is found in Vedic spirituality. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, because indeed, God is present with that person. So when you look upon that person, you can say that, yes, God is there, but that person is not God. That person still remains a finite being, so surrendered unto God, so empowered by God's presence, that God is with that person, and radically so. That's the Avesha avatar. And there have been quite a few Avesha avatars throughout history. Indeed, there have been historically more Avesha avatars, individual Atmans who are quite literally empowered by God. There have been more Avesha avatars upon the earth than Purana avatars, that is, full, pure incarnations of God. There are many of them. Indeed, the Buddha is one of them. Rishabhadeva is another. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is another. Prabhupada is another. And Jesus was also one of these Avesha avatars. So thus, when it comes to understanding the actual identity of Jesus, this is sadly where Christians have gone astray, in taking this very simplistic approach in saying, oh, he's God. He's God. Well, no. If we look at the Gospels, Jesus doesn't say this. Rather, he indicates that he is an Avesha avatar. Very quickly, let me read to you just a few of these quotes. So, for example, John chapter 10, verse 30, where he says, and this is very famous, I and the Father are one. So again, it's in a way almost understandable how mainstream Christians would misunderstand what is being said here with Jesus supposedly saying literally, I am God. But with this conception, this Vedic conception of the Avesha avatar, we can now have a more nuanced understanding of what Jesus means by these identity statements. He is not saying that he is God. Rather, he is saying exactly what I said a short time ago, that he and God are present, that when you look upon him, you are looking at the Father. Let's look at another one of these verses, and this is from John chapter 14, verses 8 and 9. Philip said unto him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us. Jesus said unto him, Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, Show us the Father? Again, it is understandable in a way that Christians would say that Jesus is quite literally saying that he is God. But no, with this added conception of the Avesha avatar, we understand that periodically, throughout human history, there can be a human being who is so surrendered unto God and who has a mission to save the world, such that that person has the presence of God with him. And when you look upon that person, it's almost as if you are looking at God as well. Very good. And just due to time, I'm going to skip a few things here. Rather than understanding, again, Jesus as being God, as being, again, this theological concept of simply Jesus being God himself, we have to understand that what Jesus is a teacher. Jesus is a guru, and that was the role that he filled when he was here. This is why he had disciples. This is why he taught them. This is why he taught by his own example, etc. Jesus was a teacher, and he was recognized as such. His disciples treated him as a guru. And interestingly, if you understand guru culture as it has existed in all of the Dharmic religions, again, not just Sanatana Dharma, not just overtly the Vedic tradition, but also in Buddhism, Jainism, also for that matter, even in the West, even among the ancient Greeks, how they treated their philosophers, and especially if you were, let's say, a disciple of a Socrates, a disciple of Plato, a disciple of Pythagoras, etc. There is a certain understanding of the nature of teacher, of the nature of guru, in which the guru is treated with tremendous respect. And again, without going deeply into this, there is an entire culture around what it means to be a guru and to have a guru. Well, we also see this reflected again in the life of Jesus, where his disciples treated him as a guru and he encouraged them to. So again, just a few more quotes just to show this. And this is from John chapter 14, verse 1, where Jesus says to his disciples, Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. Now, it's interesting that he makes that distinction. Trust in God. Trust also in me. This is also the idea of etiquette when one is approaching the guru in Vedic spirituality. That is, that you treat the guru with tremendous respect in the same way that you would God, but at the same time seeing that distinction. The guru is not God, but at the same time, you place both God and the guru on a very, very high pedestal. You have tremendous respect and devotion toward both. So here Jesus is confirming this. Just one more quote from John, and this is from chapter 6, verses 28 and 29. The disciples asked him, What must we do to do the works God requires? And Jesus answered, The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. So again, this is also the Vedic standard when it comes to the idea of guru-disciple relationship. That indeed the idea of making spiritual progress is something that's not done in a vacuum. Rather, we must have the presence and the guidance of a guru. And we must understand the guru as someone who indeed God has sent to us to guide us. So here also Jesus is saying this. Now, all this being said, to establish who Jesus actually is from the Vedic perspective. What I want to talk about now a little bit is what is the path of Jesus? What are the actual teachings of Jesus? What does it mean, let's say, if an individual in following a dharmic path, if a person wanted to see Jesus as a guide for them, to actually look at, well, okay, what does Jesus have to teach me as far as what I should do to become closer to God? Well, let's talk about this a little bit now. First of all, again, there has to be this juxtaposed understanding of mainstream Christianity versus the actual teachings of Jesus. Now, what are the teachings of, again, mainstream Christianity? It's one of blind faith. It's one of simply accepting Jesus and the sacrifice that he made upon the cross, accepting, as is said all the time by Christians, the blood of Jesus, salvation through the blood of Jesus, having faith, and it is by faith alone that we will know God. If you have faith in Jesus, you have salvation. That's basic Christianity in a nutshell. There is no mainstream Christian who would disagree with what I just said. Now, interestingly, there is someone very important who would disagree with this, and that's Jesus. Jesus would actually disagree that all that is necessary is accepting Jesus into your life and having faith in him for salvation. And how do we know this? Again, we go to the actual Gospels. We go to the actual teachings of Jesus. And there are many instances, but again, due to lack of time, I can't talk about them all. But the one that is probably most famous is the story of an individual who was a rich person. He was a young man. He was very wealthy, and he had been observing Jesus. He was a follower of Jesus. He accepted Jesus and all of his teachings. He, in a way, kind of considered himself to be a potential disciple of Jesus. And at one point, he becomes very enthusiastic, very inspired to, yes, now become a follower of Jesus. And he goes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, please accept me as one of your disciples. Please accept me as one of your followers. And it is, again, with the understanding that he had absolute faith in Jesus as a person. So his faith was not lacking. His acceptance of Jesus was not lacking. And what did Jesus say to him? Jesus rejected him. And why? Well, because he was very, very wealthy. And this is what is kind of implied. It's not just the fact that he had wealth, but what is implied is that he was also materialistic. He was also somebody who really was incapable of giving up the wealth, someone who was attached to the wealth to a very significant degree. And what does Jesus say to him? Jesus rejects him. And as Jesus goes on with his disciples, they ask him, Master, why did you reject this person? He had faith in you. And Jesus said, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. So very interesting. Everybody knows this story, but very few actually understand the theological and philosophical implications of this. And again, especially when seen in the light of mainstream Christianity. Here was a person who was perfectly doing what contemporary mainstream Christianity says a person must do for salvation. He had faith in Jesus. He accepted Jesus. He claimed he wanted to surrender to Jesus. But what did Jesus say? In essence, that's nice, but you're not strong enough to follow me. You are not disciplined enough. You are not detached enough to actually do and to actually follow my path. So thus, again, this idea of having blind faith alone in Jesus, and that's all that's necessary for salvation, well, Jesus disagrees with that. So rather, what is of importance is indeed to actually do sadhana, to actually look at how did Jesus live, what were his ethics, what were his virtues, how did he approach God, what was his worldview, etc., and to then try to follow that in one's own life. So again, very quickly, just a few more quotes from the actual Gospels. And this is from Matthew now, Gospel of Matthew 16, chapter 16, verses 24 to 27. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. I'm going to just stop there for a moment because there's more. But this is important. And follow me. Not just have blind faith in me, but a person must follow me. Now let's go on. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for me and for the good news will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? So again, this is what Jesus asks his followers to do. Not just have blind faith in him, but to actually become like him, to follow in his footsteps, to, in your own way, as much as possible, replicate Jesus' example. And again, this is something that has been missing from Christianity, mainstream Abrahamic-inspired Christianity. Very good. Let's go on just a little bit more. Not very much more, actually. Very good. I wanted to talk a lot actually about the sadhana of Jesus, and this is why even taking an entire hour to give this talk, I won't have enough time, so I'm actually editing myself a little bit. But just a few more very quick things I want to say. One of the main teachings of Jesus was one of spiritual love, one of love toward God and love toward God's creation, love toward our neighbor, toward other beings, etc. This is something that was central to the teachings of Jesus. And again, just one more quote here to display this. And this is from John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, where Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So very interesting. This was one of the central teachings of Jesus. And again, we see how he himself juxtaposes what he just said with what was the, let's say, previous theological understanding of the Old Testament and of Abrahamic Judaism of his time. He even says, a new commandment. In other words, this is something that you're not familiar with, having followed the Old Testament. This is what he's telling them. And then he proceeds to explain this. Very good. Well, there's so much more to be said. But before I run out of time, one thing that I very much want to do is indeed to go even deeper into what is the Vedic understanding of Jesus, and that is the Vedic Jesus. Now, interestingly, we know that there are these works known as the Puranas. There are 18 major Puranas and 18 minor Puranas, so 36 altogether. And these are massive works. They're truly enormous. I mean, to read all of the Puranas would take almost a lifetime, actually. Each Purana, more or less, can be roughly around the same size as the full Bible, Old and New Testament combined. Some are a little bit shorter, some are much longer, actually. Padma Purana, I believe, is at least 2 or 3 times the size of the entire Bible. And again, we're talking about 36 such books. So when it comes to the Puranic tradition, there is a lot that's there. And because we're talking about such an extensive library of sacred scripture that talks about everything imaginable, from the entire history of humankind to history of other planets, to yoga and meditation and philosophy and ritual and every single thing conceivable. It is very easy for individuals to not be very aware of what's actually said in these Puranic scriptures. And as a result, very often there will be things that are in these scriptures that, again, even people who are very conversant with Hinduism may know nothing about. Well, one of these scriptures is a very, very interesting one. It's one that I read a long time ago, maybe, I forget, 20, 25 years ago, something like that. And it's called the Bhavishia Purana. And what this quite literally means is the Purana, that is, the history of things to come. The history of that which will be. So this Bhavishya Purana is a Vedic scripture. It is an accepted Purana. There's no doubt about this. Again, there are 18 accepted Puranas that have been understood historically to be orthodox Puranas. This Purana, Bhavishya Purana, is one of them. It's in the lists that are found historically. And this is a Purana that talks about things that will occur in the future. Now, keep in mind, this Purana was first put down into writing, give or take 1,000 years, approximately 5,000 years ago, something like that. And yet this Purana talks about many things that were to occur later in history. What to us now would be the past, but given that this was written 5,000 years ago, what would have been their future? And extending even further into the future, into what is even our future, going into the future thousands of years even from now. Well, one of the things that is discussed is indeed the fact that Jesus himself was someone who, in his adult life, traveled to Aryavarta. He traveled to what today would be called India. He traveled to the Himalayas, etc. He himself was an individual who studied yoga, who studied Vedic spirituality, who studied the siddhis, mystic attainments, mystic powers, etc. He studied under Vedic gurus, etc., etc. And there's been a lot of speculation about this. What was Jesus doing for those 18 years of his life where nothing is mentioned about him in any of the Gospels? That is, we understand the story of Jesus from the time he's born until 12, and then from the time he's 30 until he's 33. But there's an 18-year gap. Well, indeed, according to this scripture, Bhavishya Purana, yes, he went east from the Levant and he studied with Vedic gurus. And there's an entire section in the Bhavishya Purana that speaks about him. And I can't quote that entire section, but I wanted to quote one section here that I thought was very, something that illustrates what the actual teachings of Jesus actually are, according to, again, this Vedic scripture. So I'm going to read this to everyone. As always, if you want to follow along, please feel free to go to the description of this video and you'll see the actual verse. But this is from Bhavishya Purana, Chaturyuga Khanda, Dvitiya Dhyaya, chapter 19, verses 27 to 29. So this is actually 3 verses. And in the Sanskrit, Jesus is referred to as Isha Putra, that is the Son of God, Isha Putra. So Isha Putra, that is Jesus, declared, and this is Jesus actually teaching when he was in what we now call India. And he's speaking to a king. Please hear, O king, which dharmic principles I have established among the barbarians, the mlechas. The living entity is subject to good and bad contaminations. The mind should be purified by taking recourse of proper conduct and the performance of meditation on the chanting of the holy names of God, japa. By chanting the holy names, one attains the highest purity. Just as an immovable sun attracts the elements of all living beings from all directions, in the same way, the Lord Narayana of the Surya Mandala, solar realm, who is fixed and all attractive, attracts the hearts of all living creatures. Thus, by following spiritual principles, speaking truthful words, by mental harmony, and by meditation, O descendant of Manu, one should worship that immovable Lord. So very beautiful. Very, very beautiful. And for anyone who is truly spiritually sincere, who is out there in the audience, and I think that's the vast majority, if not all of you, this should almost give you goosebumps in hearing this. Because, again, these are the actual words of Jesus recorded in an accepted and recognized Vedic scripture. And again, feel free to look this up yourself. You have the verse, you can look it up. This section is translated. It's available online. I've seen the actual Sanskrit to this, and this translation is actually quite accurate of what I read to you. But this should almost give you goosebumps as an individual who is a follower of Sanatana Dharma. But again, especially if you were raised in the Western world, to have respect for Jesus, to understand that these are the recorded words of Jesus within a Vedic context. Again, he's not speaking to Abrahamists here. He's not speaking to followers of the Old Testament. He's not speaking to individuals who have been led astray and who are worshiping some lesser desert divinity, but rather he's comfortable. He's really within his own element here. He is an individual who, when this king encounters him, Jesus is meditating. He's in the Himalayas, actually. And this king encounters him, and Jesus is there in his element, free to practice as he knows he should, as he wishes to, free to speak as he truly wishes to this Vedic king. And what are his teachings? They are non-different from the actual Vedic scriptures. Again, sadly, just due to time, I don't have time to do a full commentary on these 3 verses. Maybe in the future I will. That would be something I would love to do, actually, as a talk. But again, if you just look at these 3 verses in your own time, just read them again, you'll see that, yes, this is the essence of Vedic spirituality. This is the very essence of the Vedic scriptures and what it means to be a spiritual person. So again, truly astounding. So thus, what is the takeaway of all this? What is the point of all this? The point of all this is that there is indeed a Vedic Jesus, not just a Christian Jesus, not just the Jesus that so many of us were either raised to understand or have understood culturally because, we live in a primarily Christian culture if you're in the Western world. And the Jesus that we are encountering here is a very different Jesus. It's not the Jesus of dogma. It's not the Jesus of fanaticism, of fundamentalism. Rather, it is a Jesus who is a rishi, who is a sage, who is a yogi, who is a guru, who is an Avesha avatar. It's a Jesus that we, as followers of Sanatana Dharma, can feel very comfortable with. And at the same time, continuing to be followers of Sanatana Dharma. You see, at no point, again, as I said earlier in this talk, at no point did Jesus tell us, oh, we have to become Christians. He never said he was a Christian. He didn't start a sect known as Christianity. Rather, what he was teaching was something that was Sanatana. It was something that was pre-Old Testament. It is something that rings true in people's ears even to this day. And the reason why that is the case, and the reason why he was such a powerful figure spiritually, is because he was teaching Sanatana Dharma. Jesus was a Vedic rishi who went to the West, who was born in the West, who was born really in the Levant. In a way, culturally, you could almost consider that the West today, even though it's actually Palestine, Israel, etc. He was someone who was born in that area, but who for 18 years traveled and studied under gurus, studied yoga, studied meditation, studied the Vedic scriptures, etc., but then took it upon himself to go back to his homeland and teach Dharma to these people, even if it ended up killing him, which sadly it did. So indeed, one can be a follower of the teachings of Jesus without having to become Christian, and while still remaining a follower of Sanatana Dharma. And again, I am not the only guru who has said this. Prabhupada said this. Yogananda said this. So many gurus throughout history have said this, that indeed we can appreciate the teachings of Jesus and still remain absolute and committed followers of Sanatana Dharma. So with that, I'm going to end there. I thank you very much for listening to my talk. As you could tell, there was a lot to talk about even with this talk. That's why I needed to take the full hour. And even with the full hour, you could tell I was rushing and I had to edit myself because, again, there was a lot more that I could say, including even at some point doing a commentary on these 3 verses from Bhavishia Purana, which would be something I would love to do. But just due to time, it's already the top of the hour, so we're going to stop here. And before I leave you, I just need to say a few things. First of all, again, as always, thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you for taking the time to be here, and I hope that this was something that was inspiring and helpful for you. The other thing is, I want to urge you, like I never have before, to do several things, actually. First of all, as I mention every week, we have an email list. If you go to our website, dharmacentral.com, you'll see that you can join our email list. Please do that. And I'm asking you now, like I have never asked you before. It's actually important right now in history. It's very important that we remain in touch, because all of the social media platforms are insecure right now. We don't know what's going to happen with them over the course of the next several weeks or month or 2. So it's important that we remain in touch, and this is the way that we can remain in touch. Please join our email list, give us your email address, so that if for some reason or another these platforms go down, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc., 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 we can still remain in touch. That's the first thing, is please take this seriously. If you want to remain in touch with us, given anything that could happen, please join our email list. The second thing is also please go to our BitChute channel. And again, if you look in the comments below, you'll see the direct link to that. In addition to having this channel on YouTube, we also have a BitChute channel as a backup channel. Please, I cannot emphasize this enough, please subscribe. Go to BitChute. It just takes a moment to start an account there and subscribe to our BitChute channel. It's simply the Sanatana Dharma channel on BitChute. And in that way, again, that's also another way that we can stay in touch should anything happen. I also want to say this as far as anything happening. Indeed, as I have been trying to tell people for quite a little while now, several months, we are living in indeed crazy times. Things are going to become darker until the light finally comes out. So keep that in mind. Please be very careful. Please take good care of yourselves in every way. Please make sure that you have all the supplies that you need, given, again, anything that might happen in our world. It's a crazy world, and what is happening right now historically is something the likes of which no one has experienced, no one has witnessed. It's all very much guided by the hand of God. Let me tell you this. There's no reason for fear. There's no reason for worry whatsoever. Again, things will get a little bit darker for the next maybe several days, several weeks. You know, I don't know exactly. No one does. Well, maybe someone does, but they're not telling us. But things will get a little bit darker until the sun finally arises. And when that sun arises, we are going to be living in a new realm, in a new world, the likes of which some people can begin to imagine, but most people can't even come close to how wondrous will be this new world that we're going to experience, and sooner than you think. But in the meantime, take good care of yourselves. Do not live in fear. Do not worry. Always be white-pilled. Always be positive. Always be hopeful. Always know that you are not alone. God is with us. God is with us all. God is always with us. There is never a time when God is not with us. But then also, we also are with each other. You see, we have a real community. Yes, we can be in different places throughout the world. And we are. You know, I've told people that the Dharma Nation channel, we have viewers in close to 140 nations throughout the world, including some nations you'd be shocked. We have audiences all throughout the Middle East. We have audiences in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in Turkey. We have an audience literally in 140 nations. You are not alone. There are dharmis, followers of Dharma, all around you. So know that you're not alone. Never, ever lose hope in any way whatsoever. But again, please do those two things. Join our email list and go to BitChute. go to our channel and subscribe immediately, as soon as you can. And that will be a backup channel in case anything happens to the internet. In case anything happens to the internet, we can still stay in touch in every way. Finally, I'm just going to mention this one more time because I must. Again, if you can donate to the International Sanatana Dharma Society, now is the time to do so. We have this fundraising campaign going on until midnight of December 31st. Please try to donate only if you can. If you are in any hardship, do not, please donate. We never want people to give out of hardship, but only from excess. If you have extra funds, please donate. Please become a member of the International Sanatana Dharma Society, a monthly tithing member. To do that, again, you just go to dharmacentral.com, look on the menu for membership, and that helps us tremendously when you can become an actual monthly tithing member. Please do those two things only if you are financially in a position to do so. Believe me, I know things are tough economically. A lot of people are not even employed right now, but only if you can. Please help us and help us to bring Dharma to this world. This is what this world needs now more than anything, more than political reform, more than revolution, more than economic reform, more than anything. What this world needs now is Dharma. What it needs is God. So help us to bring God to this world. And with that, again, I thank you. Take very good care of yourselves until the next time that we meet. And namaste. Jaya Shriman Narayana. Jaya Bhagavan Shri Krishna. Jaya Shri Guru. Sanatana Dharma Jayate. Dharma Rashtra Jayate. Victory to Sanatana Dharma. Victory to the Dharma nation. Evam Bhavatu. May it be so. Until the next time that we meet, please take very good care.